Our second plenary speaker, who has already partly been introduced by our first, is Ben Bradford, who's Professor at UCL of Global City Policing. And again, a very well-respected academic in this field. I won't list his many publications, but his topic this morning is very germane to our discussion. It's trust and legitimacy as assets in a rapidly changing environment. Ben, over to you.
Great, thanks very much. Thanks for the invite, it's a pleasure to be here. So people like me have spent the last 15 or 20 years doing research on relationships between police and public, on issues such as trust and legitimacy. We've mainly been concerned with what generates trust and legitimacy and the associated behaviours we think go along with those constructs or concepts. What I thought I'd do today is flip the equation somewhat and think about what trust and legitimacy do, in this case for the police. In this case, as the title suggests, to think about them as assets in a rapidly changing policing environment. So I want to do 4 things in the 20.5 minutes, according to that clock that I have. Changing times, I don't need to stress this too much to the current audience, but just to highlight the idea that we are living through changing times in the context of policing, as in so many other aspects of life, and that throws up a whole set of challenges for the relationship between police and public, which we need to seriously think about. I want to then spend a bit of time about what motivates support for change in policing, what might motivate public support or opposition for some of the changes police might want to make in response to these changing times. Introduce actually 3 case studies, not 2. There are a few typos in this slide. I had to provide them a week ago. You can't ask an academic to provide slides a week ahead of their presentation. So there's 1 or 2 typos, I'm afraid. And finally, some implications. And I'll say what I mean by tragedy when I get there. I mean, it's not too seriously, but I think there are some elements of tragedy potentially in this relationship. Changing times, I think the issue of live facial recognition technology sums up really well the kind of things I'm talking about today. New powers, new tools, new techniques that are increasingly going to become available to police that they may wish to take up and use, which run into significant levels of public opposition in some parts of the country, in some communities certainly, some communities more than others. But of course, live facial recognition technology is just one example of a whole suite of changes that arguably is sweeping through policing at the current point in time, and which will only increase in the years to come. I've highlighted here tactile options and surveillance because that's actually the 3 examples I'm going to be given. But we could, of course, be talking about lots of other things that police are doing at this point in time, which require, which need, or which at least should be based on public support for those changes that are being influenced. So what I want to talk about today really is a kind of project at work we're engaged in at the Institute for Global City Policing at UCL with my colleagues Julia Jesberg and Arabella Kyprianidis over there. Any difficult questions, they'll deal with them later. And a number of other colleagues in various aspects of this work. And when we're thinking about these issues, when we're thinking about what motivates public support for change in policing tools, powers, techniques, abilities, we take it as axiomatic that most people don't know very much about policing and police work. Most people don't know much about the powers vested in police. They don't know much about what police do on a day-to-day basis. They don't know about what new developments might be coming online in the future. So in looking at this issue, we drew on a kind of a rich literature, actually, in what you could broadly characterise as a public understanding of science. And that suggests that when people are thinking about potential change in areas about which they know very little, so gene splicing, other nanotechnology, biotechnology, new power generating techniques, these kinds of questions. When people are asked to come to judgments about developments such as that, they draw on heuristics. Nothing new here, we're all familiar with the idea of heuristics, but what's really interesting in that literature is they say that trust and affect, the emotional response to the person tasked with instituting this change, are key heuristics that people draw upon when they're thinking about gene splicing, nanotechnology, whatever it happens to be. And of course, this provides a direct link into the policing literature and what we're all talking about today. So on this account, we base our judgments on change, in large part on whether we trust, whether we feel warm about, whether we feel positive towards, whether we feel a sense of similarity with, in our case, the police. And now moving into the policing context. Now, two things to just note at the beginning, and we might come back to these later on and certainly in the questions. I think this reframes the argument that changes in policing, for example, the introduction of LFR, damages trust. That's obviously often the point that's made by people opposing those changes, that this will undermine public trust and confidence in the police. What we're saying is trust and confidence and the associated factors drive the way that people think about these changes in the first place. It's also important to note, and I think this is going to be a recurring theme throughout the conference, that if people are given more information and time to consider the kinds of issues we're interested in, they may come to different conclusions than these kind of snap decisions we're asking people to give, for example, in surveys, which I'm going to be talking about. So I'll come back to that a bit at the end, I think. Lots of terminology here: affect, trust. I also want to talk about legitimacy. So just define, just to be clear about what we're talking about. First, affect, we're talking about emotional response. For some reason, psychologists call emotion affect. I'm not quite sure why. We're thinking about how the way that people think about policing. How do the people instituting this change make me feel? And the literature on the affect heuristic, this is a quote, so I'm going to read it out. In the absence of knowledge and direct experience, emotional responses to change and those implement it influence assessments of the associated risks and benefits and willingness to support or oppose introduction and uptake. Now, crucially, in this literature on the understanding of science, affect is closely linked to, and in some senses driven by, trust, which is a concept we're more familiar with in the context of policing. What's trust? Well, I think this definition is really helpful in the current context. Trust is a willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of another that is premised in beliefs about their competency in good intentions. In other words, trust is a process that starts with a set of evaluations. Are the police competent? Are they well-intentioned towards me? Do they treat people in the right way? Those evaluations form expectations. If I called the police to report a burglary, would they turn up? Would they investigate? Would they treat me in the right way? If I have positive expectations, I'm going to call the police to report the burglary, and in doing so, I place something that I value, the crime that I experience, in the hands of the police, which involves risk. I don't know what they're going to do, but I trust that they're going to do the right thing. So it seems fairly obvious why trust might affect the way people think about new developments, because people who trust the police are more willing to grant the police extra powers, if you like, because they believe those powers won't be misused. That, in a sense, is what trust is. I think it's also interesting to talk about legitimacy. It's always interesting for me anyway. Who likes to think about the motivating powers of different aspects of people's relationships with the police. And obviously, when we're talking about police, as we've already done today, we often talk about trust and legitimacy together. What do we mean by legitimacy? Well, we could say that legitimacy wraps up the perception that police generally behave in appropriate ways. They behave in ways that I agree with. They behave in ways that I think are the right ways to behave. It wraps up that understanding with the idea that properly constituted authority that behaves in the right way, commands obedience, at least in a certain set of situations. It commands deference. It's the right thing to do to obey the instructions of properly constituted authority. So we could say a sense of normative alignment with the police, a sense of shared values with the police, will motivate a sense that they're doing the right thing, the right reason, and therefore acceptance of the kinds of things they might be wanting to do. It may also generate or simply be affect. It's just this general sense that the police are like me, they share my values, they'll try and do the right thing. Conversely, and kind of slightly more instrumentally, we could say that a sense of moral duty to obey the police provokes a more kind of passive acceptance of police actions, a sense of deference to authority. Well, they're the police, they're doing the right thing, I should accept the kinds of things that they're doing. So I think one way to think about affect, trust, and legitimacy is this is kind of a big blob of stuff that sits in people's minds that we can usefully separate out into these constructs and think about the different motivating power of affect, trust, and legitimacy. But all we're really thinking about is different aspects of the relationship that people think they have with the police. So first case study, to try and get into what's going on here. This is live facial recognition technology, unsurprisingly. This is a study that was funded and partly conducted by the London Policing Ethics Panel as part of their report into LFR that was published earlier this year. And we had an online survey, and we also conducted qualitative interviews. And what we were interested in the survey and the interviews was questions of acceptability, the limits, potential use scenarios, etc., of this new policing power. And we told people briefly what LFR was. We gave them a kind of a paragraph of explanation. Not much, but a bit. And you can see some of the headline figures here. Lots of people thought it would make it easier for the police to catch criminals. a significant minority, 40 to 50%, had privacy concerns. They were worried about their own privacy being invaded as a result of the police using this technology. And around 55 to 60% of people, when confronted with the question, do you think it's acceptable or unacceptable for the police to use AFR, terminology shift, LFR, around 55 to 60% of people said it was acceptable. So again, a significant minority of people saying it wasn't acceptable for the police to use this power. Now, two provisos here. First, that percentage varied depending on what you told people it was going to be used for. If they thought it was going to be used for serious crime and terrorism, they were much more accepting. If they thought it was going to be used for ASB and minor crimes, they're much less accepting. And the second proviso, I should have said at the beginning, none of this should be taken from me as support for any of the police tactics and powers I'm talking about. I don't know whether LFR is a good idea or not. All I'm interested in is using it as an example to explore the way that people think about change in policing. And the other examples I'll give fall into the same category. When we looked at what drove acceptance according to that measure and some other measures in the survey, the thing that came out really importantly was a sense of the values of the police align with them, what we call normative alignment concept of legitimacy. And interesting studies on drone use in the United States, for example, have found much the same thing. Crucially, all of this affects, all of the association between legitimacy, a sense of the police share your own values, and acceptance of this new power was mediated by privacy concerns. People who trusted and hold the police legitimate were much less worried that police would use LFR to invade their privacy, and that's why they were more likely to accept the use of this power. Conversely, people who didn't trust the police, didn't grant them legitimacy, had much greater concerns about the use of LFR. Second case study, armed police. This is a study funded by MOPAC. Here we've got survey-based and experimental components of this piece of research. And what we're interested in doing for the purposes of today was comparing the effect of trust and effect as predictors of support for arming more police with things that were going on, in particular, I'm going to highlight terror attacks. And we're also interested in the question of causal ordering. What comes first, trust or effect, and how do these shape policy preferences? So the question in the survey we had to work with was this: the Metropolitan Police Service is currently increasing the number of officers carrying a firearm as part of their routine patrols. To what extent do you agree or disagree this is a necessary step to keep London safe? Now, I think that's a loaded question. I wouldn't have designed the question in that way. It's interesting that this survey has a higher level of support for arming police than other surveys that have used more neutral questions. Doesn't matter. We're looking at what predicts support for policy. We have measures of effect. We have measures of trust. We have measures of legitimacy in the experiment. We also have relevant confounds, fear of crime, worry about terrorism, political ideology, and so forth. And what we found when it came to policy preference, positive effect was more or less the same as policy support. If the idea of armed police officers made you feel safe, if you thought they were friendly, if you had this kind of a positive emotional relationship with them, you were going to support them arming more police. If you didn't have that kind of emotional relationship with the police, basically you were going to oppose arming more police officers. And crucially, effect was very, very strongly predicted by trust. If you trusted the police, you had positive effect. If you didn't trust the police, you had negative effect. By contrast, proximity to terror attacks had no effect on opinions. So this is using data from MOPAC's Public Attitude Survey. People who are surveyed on every day through the year, except Christmas Day and possibly Boxing Day. Over the study period, we had 5 terror attacks, unfortunately. So we were able to look at the opinions of people who were interviewed in the week following a terror attack and compare those to the opinions of people interviewed at other times. There was no difference between those two groups. So current events, aren't shaping your response to this particular policy development. What is shaping your response to this particular policy development is your trust and effect. In the experiment, we wanted to see how people thought about armed versus unarmed police officers. We wanted to see whether trust shaped their opinions, and we wanted to see whether exposure to more armed police compared with less armed police had a knock-on effect on legitimacy. And what we found is, yes, people responded less positively to images of armed officers. We just showed them images, literally, of police and got them to rate them friendly, not friendly, approachable, not approachable, aggressive, not aggressive. People rated the images of armed officers less positively. Their responses to all the images were very strongly predicted by their trust judgments. Again, if you trusted the police, you had a more positive emotional response to the image of a police officer. But exposure to more armed police had no knock-on effects on legitimacy. People tended not to like armed police, we're socialised in a culture where there are no guns, essentially. We don't like the sights of guns on our face. But this had a few downstream implications. So one way to think about this, we think this is a reflection of everyday life. We view policing through a lens established by trust and legitimacy. What happens in policing, the developments in policing, don't refract back on that lens because our trust and legitimacy judgments are, if you like, more foundational aspects of our relationship with the police. Third case study, very quickly, is a vignette-based study assessing the acceptability of police use of force options. So in a sense now combining use of force and technology, comparing baton, CS, taser options versus talking down and non-compliant handcuffing. Basically, we just gave people a scenario. I won't read it out. It's just a little... you imagine you come across an interaction between a police officer and a member of the public. You read about what a police officer does. Do they do the right thing or not? In this case, by using force of various times. The vignettes were accompanied by images of an officer with a relevant piece of kit to really bring home to people what was going on. What we found is really interesting, I mean, I just think this is just kind of tangential to what I'm saying, that baton was seen as less acceptable than CS and taser. You ignore the percentages because it's not a representative sample. We're looking at the differences between the conditions. So 70% of people where the taser was used thought the police action was acceptable, 60% where the baton used thought that was acceptable. Respondents didn't distinguish between the use of force and a threat. So we said that there was no distinction between red dotting with the taser and actually firing with the taser. Again, I'm not quite sure what to make of that. I think it's interesting. But crucially, what I say to say, responses to the vignette were strongly predicted by trust and legitimacy. If you trusted the police, if you granted them legitimacy, you were much more likely to say that what the police did was acceptable. If you didn't, you're much less likely to say what the police did was acceptable across all these different conditions. And again, exposure to the use of force compared to talking down, the kind of neutral option, exposure to the use of force had no effect on trust and legitimacy. So again, we've got this idea that trust and legitimacy shapes the way you view police actions. The subsequent actions don't reflect back on your judgments of the police, at least in terms of trust and legitimacy. So if trust and legitimacy are so important, and it really seems that they are in this space as in many others, but where do they come from? Well, we know that procedural justice is key. Again, this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone in this room. A sense that the police are well-intentioned, they behave in normatively appropriate ways, and where appropriate should be deferred to, in other words, a sense of trust and legitimacy, stems most importantly from judgments about the neutrality, the respect, the openness, the voice carried in police activity. What this means, I think, is that support for these new tools and tactics, this kind of high-level policing in some senses that I've just been talking about, is established during personal and vicarious contacts with officers. The kind of everyday, the mundane reality of policing, the everyday contact between individual officers, groups of officers, and members of the public. These teachable moments, they occur every day, and they have implications for the way that people think about police activity right across the spectrum, not just in terms of that individual interaction itself, but the way that people think about really some of the high-level policing developments I've been talking about, and I could have given many other examples. I think this is where the tragedy comes in, because these dots are all too rarely connected. So support for new policing powers, new policing practices, new policing abilities, tools, doesn't seem to stem from a sense of threat or fear, but rather a sense of trust and the feeling that police do the right thing for the right reasons. But this sense of trust is often challenged by police actions in other areas, precisely often in those areas where new policing powers, tools and techniques might be needed. So it's going to lead to withdrawal for support for these new tools and practices in precisely those places and communities where they are needed the most, because trust, because legitimacy is so important. So I think there's a need to think much more clearly about the negative implications and kind of perverse outcomes of everyday police activity in the way that people think about these much bigger questions around policing. Or for academic colleagues in the room, the experience of low policing shapes assessments of high policing in really important ways. Just to conclude, nothing that I've said so far should be taken to imply that this trust and legitimacy grant the police carte blanche. It's not the case that if people trust you, if people grant legitimacy to you, you're able to do whatever you want. There are limits to what people will expect. Indeed, an idea of bounded authority, a sense that the police operate within appropriate normative, ethical, value-based frameworks, has been found to be an important predictor of legitimacy, net of trust, and all the other things that we know flow into legitimacy. What I think is really interesting and slightly problematic is we do very little to map out these boundaries. which means they're exposed ad hoc by policing activity. So the kind of classic example here is spy cops. Apparently a bunch of cops thought that what they were doing there was okay. When it was revealed, it created a very significant public backlash, or at least a backlash from sections of the public. I think that was a very good point made earlier on. We need to do much more to map out what people will find acceptable where and in relation to whom. Now, I don't think surveys of the kind of I'm talking about today are particularly useful ways of doing that. We need more qualitative and particularly we need more deliberative work to kind of map out the boundaries of what people will and will not find acceptable. But this mapping work, just to conclude, I think will throw up some real challenges that we need to be alive to. So what is acceptable in one place might not be acceptable elsewhere. So, for example, live facial recognition technology, which we refer to believe the Met will assist in the fight against crime, was most opposed by young people, people from black ethnic groups, and people with Muslim religion. In other words, people who are likely to live in parts of town where extra police powers might be most needed. Those are the people most opposed to these new powers that may make policing better in those areas. And the final point, and I think we would do well to consider that for our deliberations today, is that some people will be willing to accept too much. Some people will be willing to grant the police too much power, certainly in relation to the policing of marginalised and excluded outgroups. People will accept policing in relation to them that they will never accept in relation to themselves. This means there's a real need for an internal, what you could call an internal locus of control within police organisations. We need police officers who can make these kind of decisions as well. We need police officers understanding of where the moral and ethical boundaries of their activity should lie. And I'll finish there. Thank you.